Hey guys, so in this lecture we will understand what is data grid through a demo. So in this lecture I will not be going through slides, we will be directly jumping onto our demo and see how data grid works. Now if you are working with any WPF application, it's very important for you to display data onto the screen, right? And for that purpose there is data grid. So data grid is just like all traditional data grids that's available in the ASP.NET, WinForms, etc. So please don't get confused between a grid and a data grid. A grid is something which is a panel which holds your elements of WPF screen, and data grid is the control which is responsible for displaying data onto the UI. So let's quickly go to our demo and start learning what is a data grid. So here I have a very simple application which is called as WPF DataGrid. Now what we will try to do is we will make a class and we will have a few properties in it. Then we will make a collection of that class, and then we will try to display all those contents of that class or all the objects what we have created in those class onto our data grid. Okay, so let's begin. Let's add a class in here. So let's go to add, let's add a class and let's rename it to student class. Okay, so I have my class student ready. Now I will just give it a public modifier. So now I have some pre-typed properties with me in order to save time. So let me paste those properties in here. So I will go through it. First property is integer data type and it's called as ID. So it will represent student ID. Then it's name, second property. Third property is a that it is a whether the student is a soccer player or not. So it will specify that our students plays football or not. Okay, and fourth property is gender property. Now why it's giving a error? Because I will be creating a enum of male and female which will be called as gender. So let me make a enum gender out of the class. So I will have public enum gender, and then I will have male and a female. Okay, so here's my enum which is declared, and now you can see that my gender property is identifying which enum it's referring to. Okay, now this is our model class which is ready. Okay, now we need to get a collection of these students. Okay, so I will have to define a method which will retrieve all the students which I will define in my code in a observable collection. Okay, so for guys who are new to observable collection, please go and watch my previous lecture in which I have explained what's the difference between a list and observable collection. Also you can also watch my MVVM lectures too. So I have again a pre-typed code with me, so let me paste that code in here. So first I need to import a namespace for this observable collection. So here it goes. I guess it's there, system.collections.object model, and now I have my method also ready. So let me explain you what this method does. It retrieves the student lists. Okay, and the return type of this method is a observable collection of student type. Okay, then what I do is I store this observable collection which is returned by this method in a student collection. Okay, and that student collection then I initialize new students. Okay, so you can see the ID is 1, name is John. Is soccer player is a boolean type of property, so it says true. So John is a soccer player and gender is male. Similarly, I have a few more students defined. So it's Johnny, Tim, Lucky, and Lucy. Fine. And then all it does is return the student collection. Okay. So this is my method which will be responsible for populating the data grid. Okay. So now let's define our UI, or let's define our data grid. Okay. So let's go to the main window.xaml and let's have a data grid. So let's have a data grid. Let's give it a name, and what should we call it? My data grid. Okay, let's close this. Fine, our data grid is defined. it will by default take the height and width of our window. Okay, now let's do one more thing. Let's go to the main window.xaml or the code behind, and let me then have my data grid dot data context. Sorry, I will set the data context. Okay, so I will say my data grid dot item source equals, and from where we are getting the data is from the student class. So let me have student dot get students method. Okay, now how I am calling this get student method directly from the student class? That's because my get student method is a static method. Okay, so I'm not creating any object of the student class. Okay, so here I am setting the data context of this data grid. Okay, so I am setting the item source of this data grid as get students. Now let's try to run this application and see if our data grids works or not. Now it's working, and there are some very nice points to note about data grid. Okay, so you can see, if I expand this, that what we don't need to define the column names of our data grid. Okay, so whatever be the name of the properties that is defined in our model class, that will be automatically picked up by data grid as the column name. So I had a property called as id, name, a soccer player, and gender. Okay, so these are the column names of our data grid. Now these values are text boxes. Okay, so I can edit those, right? Now remember, if you need to propagate the two-way data binding, so you need to implement iNotify property chain interface onto your class. I'm not doing so. That's just to make this video as simple as it gets. Okay, so if you're not aware of what is a iNotify property chain interface, please watch my previous lecture of iNotify property chain interface. Okay, so these all fields are text boxes by default, and you can edit those fields. Okay, so same goes here. Okay, now if you remember, we had a property of is soccer player. Let's look into that property, and you can see what's the return type of this property. It's a boolean. Okay, so all the boolean properties become automatically becomes check boxes in data grid. Okay, so if you need to display certain check boxes onto your data grid, how will you will do it? You will just make a property whose return type is boolean. And this is also a very good interview question, that if you need to display check boxes on your data grid, how you will do it. Okay, and now let's see the gender property. Okay, so what was our gender property? It was a enumeration. Okay, or enum. So I have defined my enum in here. So gender could be male or female. Okay, so the moment you will define any property which is a enumeration type, that columns will be by default combo boxes. Okay, so you can select either male or female. So this is also a very good question, that how will you incorporate combo boxes on your data grid? The answer is just make your property as a enumeration. The column will be uh, declared as a combo box by default. Okay, let's close this application. Let me make another option in here, say unknown. Okay, okay, now let's try to run this, and it should have the combo box with 3 items: male, female, and unknown. Okay, so it's very simple. So you can see the power of data grid. It's awesome. So, and it becomes very easy. Now there are certain scenarios where you do not want these properties to be automatically picked as column names. Okay, so here is where data grid becomes tricky. Fine, so let me show you that how we can have our custom defined columns in our data grid. So let's go to our main window.xaml, and there is a property called as auto generate columns. So let me make this property as false. Now let's try to run this. Now our data grid won't pick any column from our properties. You can see there is some ugly looking data grid in our system. So let me close this, and now let's try to make some custom columns for our application. So let me remove this closing tag and let me have another data grid. Sorry. So I will have data grid dot columns. So I will have data grid dot columns to define my data grid. And now we can define our custom columns in here. So data grid, so you can see there are few options for me to select. It's data grid checkbox column, data grid combo box column, data grid hyperlink column, which will contain all the hyperlinks, and data grid template column, so and so on. So I will just select data grid text column because my ID and name both are text fields. So I will just have these. So I will say, or I should remove this and remove this also, and let me close this in here. Okay, let me define a header. So this will be responsible of header of my column. So I will just say student ID, and let me specify a data source. So I will say binding is binding equals ID, and let me close data grid also here. Now similarly we can have 2 or 3 more columns in here. So let me paste these columns in here. Okay, so next column is data grid text column, and the header is name of students, and I am binding name property, just similar as I was doing with ID column. Okay, now I have data grid checkbox column, and the header of this is does student play soccer. Okay, so I have misspelled it. Does student play soccer is the header, and I'm binding is soccer player. Okay, let's try to run this application now. And you can see now we have our custom names in our data grid. Okay, now let's have our fourth column. So the reason I didn't include the fourth column here was because it's a bit tricky to bind enum properties onto our data grid, and the reason why it is a bit tricky I will explain you in a bit. So let me have the enum column first included. So what was it? It was data grid combo box column. Okay, so I will say header is, let me call it as gender itself, and let me have binding markup just like as we are doing here. So combo box does not have a binding tag with it, it says selected item binding. Okay, so now let me have binding, and let's bind the gender property. Okay, now let's try to run this application, and you can see, you will see in fact that your gender column is empty. So can you guess why it's empty? So the reason why it's empty is because we are binding here objects, okay, or references types, right? So these all properties are part of my student class. But what about this gender? This is also a part of my student class, right? But you can, as you can see in the code behind, this gender property is defined outside the class, and a enum is not a reference type, it's a value type. So this is a very important point for you to remember. You cannot bind enum types or value types directly as you bind objects in WPF. For you to be able to bind these value types, you need to specify a object data provider. Now I am not going to explain you what is a object data provider because it's a separate topic and it's a very important interview topic. Okay, for the sake of this demo I will just directly write a object data provider and then bind my enum to the screen, right? The reason why I'm doing this is because I don't want all the students to miss the topic of object data provider in this long video. Okay, so just remember why I am using object data provider to bind this enum property is because enum is a value type, it's not a object, it's not a object of student class. Okay, right? So let me have my object data provider defined. So the You define object data provider as a window resource. So you have window dot resources, close these resources. Okay, so your window resources are ready, and you define object data provider, and let's give it as a key. So remember my lectures on static resources and dynamic resources, you need to define a key, right? So I will say my provider, and then with object data provider you need to define a method. Okay, so it's a method which is defined in XAML. So you can name a method any method name. Okay, I am just giving it as a get values, and then I need to specify that where you need to have you need to provide object for which class. Okay, so I will have object type, and then you will specify the class for which you need to provide the object. So for our case, what we need to do, we need to provide object for enum class, right? For that we need to make a separate namespace. Let me call as ns. So ns equals, and you need to specify the namespace which contains the enum class. So system.microlib is the class which is responsible for enum class. Okay, so I will import that namespace, and then I will have x, I will say x dot type is enum. Okay, so I will be providing object for this enum class, right? Or enum is a keyword, so I will have capital E in here. Okay, so we have enum class. So why I'm getting this error is because I've not referenced the namespace what I've created. And then let me open this again. Let me have, since we have defined a method, we will have to specify the method here. Okay, so it's method name, or rather we should make it a method parameter since we are supplying a method here. Okay, so what this method will do, it will provide the object for this enum class, and we'll just say x type name, or type of x is type name is gender. Okay, so this might be a bit confusing for you or complex to you because you are not uh, accustomed to these object data providers. For the people who are who understands what is an object data provider, this is quite simple thing. Okay, so don't worry about this. I will just cover this topic once I'm done with these lectures. So I have closed the object data provider in here. I'm again making a mistake here, so I need to define the local namespace. My gender class is present in this local namespace. Okay, because the name of application of my application is WPF DataGrid. Okay, now let's go in here to my DataGrid combo box column, and then I need to associate this object data provider here. So I will say the item source of this combo box column is binding. Okay, then I will specify a source of this binding, then I will again specify a static resource, and what's the name of my object data provider key? It's my provider. So if the reason if you're not understanding this is because you have not watched my static resource demo, so please go and watch it. Okay, now I guess it's very clear. I have provided a object data provider for my enum class, just because enum class was not a object, it was a value type, it was defined outside my class. Okay, now in order to for you to bind any value types or any values which are not objects, you need to provide object data provider. So this thing I have done it in here. Okay, now let's try to run this. So let's run, and you can see our output is on our window. Okay, so remember that DataGrid is a very powerful control of WPF. If you are working with data applications, you need to use DataGrid. So I have made this video just to help you out. Also, it's a very important point to note you down, for you to note it down, that if you need to display checkboxes or combo box, how you can do in DataGrid. For checkboxes you need to use boolean properties. For combo box you need to use enums. Okay, now anything which is not object, you need to provide object data provider. So I will be covering this topic, object data provider, in one of my upcoming videos. Till then, if you have not understood it, just go through this video, try to make it, and you will understand what I was trying to say. Okay, so thank you so much guys for listening to this lecture. If you have any doubt, please leave a comment below, and please do subscribe to my channel. Also, please do like my Facebook page for all the latest updates. Thank you so much.